Hello and welcome to my final broadcast of 2011. It's December 30th, 2011, and on today's broadcast we're going to start the show off with a bang and go to our phone lines to speak with our guest for today's program, the head of the Libertarian Party of Riverside, California, and a very good friend of mine, Gene Berkman. Thank you, Gene, for once again being a guest on our show.
Hi, Bruce. It's a pleasure to be on your program again and to talk about the New World Order and the threats to American freedom.
Now, Gene, I want to get your thoughts on the Republican Party and mainstream media's attempt to discredit longtime champion of civil liberties and fellow libertarian Ron Paul, with allegations surfacing of Paul publishing a series of newsletters in the 1980s and 90s that included racist and homophobic remarks. Now, this, in my mind, is a clear attempt to discredit the most constitutionally correct candidate in the race. Your thoughts?
Congressman Ron Paul's campaign for president has brought about a remarkable grassroots upsurge of interest in stopping the warfare welfare state. Americans have been looking for somebody to champion limited government because they know the U.S. government is out of control. They've been looking for somebody to say that we don't need to go around the world and try to solve all the world's problems through either foreign aid or through bombing them. And Congressman Ron Paul is speaking for this grassroots upsurge. So naturally the establishment is worried. And the latest attempt to derail his campaign involves allegations concerning newsletters that he was associated with in the early 1990s.
Now, there's also news surfacing that the Paul campaign has received payments from admitted white supremacist groups. Again, Paul can't control who contributes to the campaign, but this surely raises some red flags.
The important date to consider is 2002, when Congress was voting to authorize the president to go to war in Iraq. Congressman Ron Paul stood against granting this unlimited grant of power to President Bush. He was one of very few in the Republican caucus of the Congress to oppose the Iraq war, and he was marginalized within the Republican Party for several years. By 2008, Americans had figured out that the Iraq war was a big mistake and a big tragedy. Iraq did not have weapons of mass destruction. Iraq was not involved in the operations on 9/11. And the evil dictator of Iraq, as bad as he was on his last legs and about to lose power in any case. Instead of allowing the natural occurrence of the Iraqi people overthrowing their dictator, the U.S. went in and made itself dictator of Iraq at a cost of 100,000 Iraqi lives and hundreds of billions of dollars in American taxpayer money, as well as perhaps 5,000 American soldiers dying and 40,000 being wounded. Congressman Ron Paul stood against this in 2002, and in 2008, when the American people had figured out what a tragedy Iraq was, Ron Paul's campaign took off. He entered the campaign for president in 2008 just to show that there was an upsurge in the country against big government and against the warfare state. He's continuing the campaign this year, and based on the recognition he got for his campaign in 2008, the support he got for his campaign in 2008, this campaign has become very significant. He got a solid 22% in the Iowa caucuses, and he's running second place in New Hampshire, in the New Hampshire polling, behind Governor Romney of Massachusetts. So for all those reasons, the establishment wants to tear down the Ron Paul campaign, and they're bringing up little things. David Duke supported George W. Bush in 2000, and we heard nothing about it. Some meaningless white supremacist sends a couple $100 to the Ron Paul campaign, and it's everywhere on the net and in the media. It's meaningless. Ron Paul raised $35 million in 2008, and maybe $1,000 of that came from white supremacists. Totally meaningless. He hasn't trimmed his sails to appeal to them. He hasn't changed his views to appeal to them. He does not endorse what they do or what they say. They are looking for some way to influence the election, and the minor way they have gotten is a few of them send a few dollars to Ron Paul. Others send money to Rick Santorum. Others send money to Newt Gingrich. It's meaningless. $1,000 out of a $35 million campaign.
Now, Gene, I want to get your thoughts on a more serious topic here, the topic of abolishing the Federal Reserve, and also preventing war with Iran, two topics that Congressman Ron Paul is at the forefront of.
The Federal Reserve System was established by an act of Congress in 1913, a very unlucky year for America, and they set it up for the specific purpose of giving the government the power to influence the business cycle. They said if the government can influence the business cycle, then when there's high unemployment, the Federal Reserve can act financially to decrease unemployment. And when there's too much inflation, the Federal Reserve can act to cut back inflation. The actual record of the Federal Reserve has been that it has promoted bubbles. It promoted the real estate bubble in the 2000s, and now we're all suffering from it. It promoted loose lending to business, and businesses overexpanded. Many businesses are now in bankruptcy because they overexpanded and borrowed too much when it was easy to borrow. This was Federal Reserve policy. Why did the Federal Reserve promote this bubble in real estate? Why did the Federal Reserve promote loose lending to business? The effect of President George W. Bush's deficit spending, his hundreds of billions for the Iraq War, his hundreds of billions for expanding the welfare state in America, meant that the private economy was being crowded out by the needs of the federal government. So the Fed, to prevent the depression that would have occurred if we just let the federal government take all the money out of the private economy, injected insane amounts of money into the U.S. economy. And the result was some of it went to productive activity, but an awful lot of it went to excessive expansion of business. It went to leveraged buyouts. It went to mergers and acquisitions. It went to any number of financial gambles that have nothing to do with productivity. And the biggest gamble was that millions of Americans, faced with constantly rising real estate prices, gambled that if they bought a house, they could sell it for more quickly. And some of them did. Some people did make some money, but an awful lot of people got priced out of the real estate market, and others ended up massively in debt and living in homes that are worth less than they owe on them. This is all the result of Federal Reserve policy. Congressman Ron Paul calls for ending the Federal Reserve, taking the federal government out of the monetary system, and having honest money based on gold and silver, so that the value of people's productivity is protected, so that when you save $1, it will be worth $1 when you go to take it out of the bank and are ready to spend it. Now, if you put $1 in the bank, when you take it out a year later, it's worth less. If you take it out 5 years later or 10 years later when you're retired, it's worth even less. And the result is people can no longer save for their retirement. They're in debt. They're facing financial questions that middle-class Americans never had to face before, and we're facing an entire generation that will go into retirement hoping that there's a Social Security check waiting for them, and yet the federal government is so broke there will be no guarantee of a Social Security check. So we need to end the Federal Reserve System and restore honest money and restore a free market, with the federal government having much less influence on our economic activities and our economic decisions. On the issue of Iran, we're hearing the same propaganda that was used to whip up war fever against Iraq. Iraq had no weapons of mass destruction. It had no program for developing nuclear weapons. Right now, the Central Intelligence Agency says that if Iran undertook a program to develop nuclear weapons, it would be 5 to 10 years before they could develop one, but there's no evidence that they have a crash program to develop nuclear weapons. They have blustering by Iranian leaders who want America to think they have nukes because they saw what happened when it became clear that Iraq had no nuclear weapons with which to defend itself. It was seen as an easy target for the Bush League element running the U.S. government that wanted to expand American influence in the Middle East. Now, nobody wants to defend the government of Iraq under Saddam Hussein or the government of Iran under the mullahs. They are authoritarian, oppressive governments, and the people of those countries who wish to struggle for freedom have our sympathy. But the U.S. government is not capable of bringing democracy and freedom to a culture that is so alien to us that when we send soldiers over there, they cannot even communicate with the people that they are supposedly liberating. The situation right now with Iran is that they have a government run by reactionary religious leaders, and they have fears about their own country being attacked, and because of this they talk a lot about how powerful they are, but they have nothing to back it up. They have no nuclear weapons, they have no delivery system for delivering nuclear weapons, and they are in a region where they are surrounded by other countries with nuclear weapons. Russia and China are both very close to Iran, and they both have nuclear weapons. France and Britain are both within range to deliver an atomic bomb on Tehran at any time, and the U.S. of course has hundreds of intercontinental ballistic missiles. For a country as powerful as the United States to be afraid of a country like Iran, which cannot even provide gasoline for its own people to drive, is just crazy talk. And yet we have Mitt Romney and Rick Santorum and all these other politicians whipping up hysteria about Iran because they think it's the road to getting the Republican nomination for president. It's time for the American people to say, we don't want a politician like that claiming leadership of this country. We want somebody who recognizes how strong America is and how little we have to fear from a backward country that has no possibility of threatening us or our allies.
Now, Gene, I myself am a firm believer in non-interventionism, and Ron Paul is, of course, and this is partly true because of our support for the Libertarian Party and the Libertarian viewpoint. But Congressman Ron Paul is being called anti-Semitic for simply stating the fact that Israel is fully capable of taking care of themselves, both militarily and economically. Also, Obama has pledged $80 billion in military aid to Israel.
Israel has the strongest economy in the Middle East. It has an economy based on the real wealth in the modern age, which is human capital. It has a high-tech industry. It has an educated workforce, and it no longer, in fact, relies on economic aid from the United States. We do continue to supply military equipment to Israel, and everybody in American politics is agreeable to that. Even Pat Buchanan has stated we should supply Israel with whatever they need to defeat any enemy or any combination of enemies. This was Pat Buchanan's stand when he ran for president. And Ron Paul's stand is that we now supply 4 times as much aid to enemies of Israel as we supply to Israel. We are not supplying $80 billion worth of weapons to Israel. We're supplying $80 billion worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia, which is the country that supplied 15 of the 19 hijackers, the country that supplied the funding for the hijacking and the attack on 9/11. President Obama is interested in continuing the George W. Bush policy of friendship with Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is no friend of Israel. Jews are banned from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia does not recognize the existence of the State of Israel. Ron Paul would cut off sales of weapons to Saudi Arabia and sales of weapons to other enemies of Israel. Ron Paul would cut off foreign aid to Israel, and he would end foreign aid to Israel as he ends foreign aid to every other country. Israel can stand up on its own 2 feet, and every other country in the world deserves the chance to be independent. We, of course, as a libertarian, Ron Paul and I favor trade and economic development, including investment in Israel and other countries in the Middle East. But there is no point in supplying military aid to Israel's enemies and then trying to make up for it by supplying a lesser amount of military aid to Israel. That makes no sense at all. It's not an original policy. In the past, we have sold weapons to both sides in several conflicts, including during the Iran-Iraq War, when the United States supplied weapons free of charge to the oppressive regime of Saddam Hussein, while at the same time Ollie North was selling weapons to Iran. It just makes no sense. A policy of non-interventionism sounds like you're trying to ignore the troubles in the world, but it's actually based on recognizing that the troubles in the world are too complicated for Americans to solve by ourselves, and it's time that we ensure that we have an adequate defense while leaving the rest of the world alone to solve their own problems.
But of course, we cannot take away from the Bush family and their ties to the Saudi Arabian kingpins. Also, Gene, Newt Gingrich, neocon Newt Gingrich, is one of the harshest critics of Congressman Ron Paul out there, but Gingrich himself was paid up to 1.6 or 1.8 million by one of the investment banks responsible for the bursting of the housing bubble, and that's Freddie Mac. It's also interesting to note that Gingrich takes part in the occult-style ceremonies conducted here in Northern California at the Bohemian Grove. I want to get your thoughts on Newt Gingrich.
Long before George W. Bush became president on his program of compassionate conservatism, which we all knew to be big government conservatism, Newt Gingrich was one of the original big government conservatives. In the mid-70s, he began his political ascent as a member of Congress, and when he was on William F. Buckley's firing line, he went out of his way to say he is not a libertarian. He believes in a positive role for government in promoting change in America. And his entire political career has been based on promoting this positive role for government. As Speaker of the House of Representatives, he did preside over a Republican majority that did make some cuts in government, including reforming welfare and closing many military bases. But his own political program has always been a matter of increasing the power of the federal government, and in particular, expanding our foreign interventionism and expanding the domestic control that the federal government has over our personal lives. In 1988, Newt Gingrich introduced a bill, the Drug and Crime Emergency Act, to declare a 5-year state of emergency to deal with the drug issue. A state of emergency is a special situation in which the president has more power than usual and the federal government has more power than usual, and normal constitutional guarantees are swept aside. His bill, H.R. 4079, would have also expanded many of the federal government's anti-drug programs, expanded penalties for drug-related crimes, and made it far easier to send people to federal prison. At the same time, it would have mandated a work requirement for all prisoners in federal prison. If people are there for legitimate crimes against life, liberty, or property, yes, they should work. But creating a whole class of people arrested for the simple act of possessing marijuana or some other illegal, euphoric drug, and then sending them to prison to work at less than minimum wage, at less than the wages that are paid in communist China, is a recipe for slave labor to replace the free labor that has characterized American business for 300 years. Newt Gingrich is a dangerous person, and so dangerous that even many conservatives consider him a threat to the future of America and the future of the Republican Party. Mitt Romney, on the other hand, is probably the most principled candidate running. He has 2 sets of principles for every issue. He's simultaneously for and against abortion rights. He's simultaneously for and against federal aid to education. He's simultaneously for and against allowing states to control their own education. Mitt Romney, there's no way to know what he actually believes in or what he actually stands for, and my fear is that he has decided that the average Republican is most concerned with going to war over Iran, and he will pander to them by promising to go to war over Iran. Rick Santorum, his entire career in the U.S. Senate was devoted to supporting whatever new big government program the Republican leadership came up with. When George W. Bush was president, Rick Santorum voted to raise the national debt limit every time it became an issue. Rick Santorum voted for No Child Left Behind to increase federal control over education. Rick Santorum, as senator from Pennsylvania, voted for the prescription drug bill that is going to bankrupt the Medicare system. Rick Santorum talks about being a conservative, but when any issue comes up where it's a question of the federal government having more power, if the Republican leadership says the federal government should have more power, Rick Santorum has gone along with that. None of them provide an alternative to President Obama's and his big government push. The only alternative is Congressman Ron Paul of Texas, who's promoting the limited government views of libertarian and free market capitalism. And Congressman Ron Paul is the only Republican running who offers a foreign policy vision of America at peace with the world, ready to defend its own independence, but willing to respect the independence of every other nation. So there really is only one choice in the primaries, but it's pretty clear that the establishment of the Republican Party is more interested in having a big government conservative than having somebody who stands for the Constitution.
Now, as you already know, North Korean dictator Kim Jong-il recently passed away this month. What do you think the future holds for the isolated military power, and how could this affect the U.S. in that region?
Well, the good news is that Kim Jong-il, the South Korean leader, the dear leader as they called him, is dead. The bad news is that another in his family is taking over as leader of North Korea. North Korea is a country that poses a real threat to an American ally, South Korea. South Korea is clearly stronger. It has a stronger economy, it has a stronger military, and it can defend itself. But the North Koreans are so propagandized by the communist philosophy of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il that they are willing to face the threat of their own destruction in order to bring about a unity of the Korean Peninsula. Where America comes into this, we can't do a damn thing because the Iraq War has bankrupted us, has destroyed our military, has caused our military to not be at the level of readiness that it was at for many years. And if Kim Jong-il makes any threats towards South Korea, there's nothing we can do about it except condemn him. But we can't do anything to offer any actual aid to the South Koreans because we have nothing to offer. We are trillions of dollars in debt, and our military is not yet recovered from the fiasco of the Iraq War. All of this was known at the time that President Bush pushed for a war with Iraq. It was known at the time that North Korea was closer to developing weapons of mass destruction, and it was known that North Korea had a leader who was far more aggressive than Saddam Hussein. But President Bush, with his desire to dominate the Middle East in league with Saudi Arabia, ignored all that and instead got us into the quagmire of Middle Eastern war. The situation in North Korea is something we'll have to watch, and we can hope the South Koreans can deal with whatever problems come up, because America is in no position to do anything right now thanks to Bush's fiasco in Iraq.
Now on to a very serious matter concerning the constant loss of our civil liberties and freedoms here in America. In a report from antiwar.com, Congressman Ron Paul recently stated that the National Defense Authorization Act, recently passed by the Obama administration, is making the Fourth Amendment, ladies and gentlemen. Basically, it's making it null and void. The National Defense Authorization Act allows the federal government to detain Americans and deny us, the people, our right to a speedy trial, the Sixth Amendment, just under suspicion of being a threat to national security. I want to get your thoughts on this, Gene.
The National Defense Authorization Act, recently passed by Congress by overwhelming majorities with support from both Democrats and Republicans, is a serious threat to American freedom. In 2008, Americans elected Barack Obama because they were tired of the attacks on our freedom by President George W. Bush in the name of fighting terrorism. President Bush claimed the right to detain American citizens without trial because they may be aiding terrorist organizations. The National Defense Authorization Act, passed under President Obama, codifies into law the President's power to detain Americans on suspicion that they may be aiding terrorist organizations. And this is far worse than it sounds. Everybody's against terrorism, and people are afraid since 9/11 that there may be a terrorist threat to America. But who defines terrorism under the National Defense Authorization Act are government bureaucrats who can put almost any organization, including charitable organizations, including hospitals, including other nonviolent political groups on the list as aiding terrorism. And if you send a $5 contribution to a charitable organization that is on the list of groups that aid terrorism, you could end up as a subject of the National Defense Authorization Act. It's very frightening, and what's more frightening is that there was so little opposition to it. Senator Rand Paul in the Senate and Congressman Ron Paul in the House of Representatives were the bulk of the opposition. A total of 7 senators voted no. 92 senators voted in favor of giving the President this power to detain Americans, and an overwhelming majority in the House of Representatives. So bipartisan, big government strikes once again, only in a particularly insidious attack on our freedom.
Now, unfortunately, we're out of time, but I want to take this time to thank you, Gene, for once again doing an excellent job. I appreciate your insight and knowledge.
Thanks, Bruce, for having me on your program again. Next time we'll discuss more what's happening in the crusade to restore American freedom and Ron Paul's defense of the Constitution.
If you have any questions regarding the economic crisis, government cover-ups, Big Brother, or the New World Order, be sure to contact us at the Bruce Montalvo Show at gmail.com. And welcome to the Bruce Montalvo program. It's June 22nd, 2012, and on today's broadcast I'm glad to once again have Gene Berkman join me. He's on to discuss Rand Paul's obvious betrayal of the American people by endorsing Mitt Romney, and also I want to get his conjecture on where his father, Congressman Ron Paul, stands in all this. Thank you for being on our show.
Hello, I'm Gene Berkman, Chair of Riverside County Libertarian Party.
Now, Gene, I want to get your thoughts on Kentucky Senator Rand Paul's decision to back establishment candidate Mitt Romney.
Of course, everybody interested in limited government was happy to see Rand Paul elected to the Senate 2 years ago. And in the Senate, he has been a champion of limited government and has opposed the international interventionism of the Obama administration. And he's been an active supporter of Ron Paul, his dad, in his campaign for president. But we're all disappointed to see him announce his support for former Governor Mitt Romney of Massachusetts. Just recently, Rand Paul announced on the Hannity show on Fox News that he was happy to back Mitt Romney for president. And I don't see how anybody could be happy to back that person who stands for every side on every issue and has no clear political viewpoint, except that we know he's not for limited government. Everybody's disappointed in Rand. In fact, my take on it is Rand Paul decided to sell out now and avoid the rush.
Now, this move really didn't surprise me. I saw it coming, given Rand Paul's vote for sanctions against Iran.
I think the real significance of this is Rand Paul is showing his partisan commitment to the Republican Party. For people who believe in limited government, supporting candidates through the Republican Party is sometimes an important tactic, but the Republican Party record on limited government is pathetic. Republican presidents like Nixon, Bush Sr. and Bush Jr. have pushed more government in America, have pushed us into international confrontations, and have built up the national debt to the point where even Obama is only just doing as much as they did and not more. And so to think that the Republican Party is the long-term vehicle for limited government just shows how misguided Rand Paul is. It's sad that somebody with such an upbringing and education in the principles of liberty and limited government would so betray them by being a partisan hack. It's just disappointing. His stand on sanctions for Iran, I'm sure he is not promoting a move toward war. Others who promote sanctions, of course, are using them to lay the groundwork for war. I think Rand is hoping that if we have sanctions, Iran will back down on its nuclear program and we won't have to have a military confrontation. But it's a real iffy issue in either case. He still is a freshman senator. He doesn't have a lot of experience. We can hope he grows into being the hardcore principled limited government libertarian that his dad, Ron Paul, is. But right now, I think we need to put all our support behind Ron Paul and let Rand Paul wait to get our support when he shows he deserves it.
Now, the Kentucky congressman's voting record is by him endorse and openly endorse Mitt Romney for president when Mitt stands for NDAA and drones. And to give him some credit where credit is due, he did shoot down the proposal from warmonger Marco Rubio to include Georgia, not Georgia in the United States, but to include Georgia into the UN, which would have led to conflict with Russia. So, like you said, it's really a matter of him deciding to sell out early. Also, the Romney campaign was clearly attempting to sabotage the Paul campaign despite Ron Paul's wins in Nevada and Maine. Gene, he clearly made it easier for Romney to win by not nearly campaigning enough in California or Texas.
Ron Paul is a great champion of freedom, but in his entire political career he's always had too lax a policy as far as the people he's hired to work for him. And he's had some irresponsible people at times. In 1988, when he was the Libertarian candidate for president, his campaign manager ended up embezzling large amounts of money from the campaign. And more recently, I wouldn't say that anybody in his current campaign is guilty of embezzlement, but he has relied on relatives and in-laws to an excessive degree in place of competent professional managers. And his current campaign spokesman, Jesse Benton, has not served the campaign well with his statements to the press on the issues of Ron Paul's loyalty to the Republican Party and related issues. So that's sad. The strategy of cutting back on spending in the primaries and concentrating on the state conventions has actually been successful. In Iowa, Ron Paul won a majority of delegates at the state convention. In Minnesota, he won a majority of delegates at the state convention. In Maine, he won a majority of delegates at the state convention. And this has been a very successful strategy. In fact, the only real problem in his most recent state convention strategy has been that the Romney campaign has been using Rand Paul's endorsement of Romney against Ron Paul. Rand Paul, even if he believed his political career required supporting the Republican nominee, he should have waited till the national convention or after the national convention. He's undermined his own dad's campaign for president by endorsing Romney while state conventions are still choosing delegates. Despite that, the Ron Paul campaign has been remarkably successful, and the hope is that Ron Paul will have a majority of 5 state delegations, which will allow his supporters to place his name in nomination before the convention and on national television. And right now he's got control of 4 delegations, so we're very hopeful, and we hope that Rand Paul's little misstep with Romney has not undermined the hope for a 5-state delegation for Ron Paul.
Well, Gene, that truly sounds hopeful, but what I think the main focus should be on is the fact that Congressman Ron Paul told his supporters, who often face police abuse, to be respectful in the convention at Tampa. This, in a way, kind of sounds like sit down, shut up, and do what you're told.
Actually, I'd like to urge Ron Paul supporters to be respectful. Part of the libertarian message is to respect each other's rights and respect each other's dignity. Sometimes people who are committed to a very important movement do get a little convinced of their own righteousness, and it's important to be confident in having the right stand, but you don't want to be overbearing and you don't want to disrespect other people's dignity or other people's right to their own view. At the same time, it's very clear that the real action for the Ron Paul campaign and for the Liberty Movement in Tampa will not be in the Republican convention, which will be stage managed by the Republican National Committee and by the Romney campaign. The real action will be at the Ron Paul Festival that will precede the national convention and at Ron Paul's own campaign rallies outside the convention. We're hoping to see something even bigger than the Rally for the Republic, which took place in 2008 in Minnesota outside the Republican convention. You'll remember, in 2008, since Ron Paul refused to endorse Senator McCain for president, they would not allow him to speak at the Republican convention. So he held his own rally where more than 12,000 people paid to attend a rally to hear him and to hear other great speakers talk about freedom and free enterprise and opposing the New World Order. So the real action in Tampa is not going to be in the Republican convention, which is going to be stage managed into a coronation of Mitt Romney, the only coronation he'll get since he's going to go down in flames in November. But the real action will be at the Ron Paul Festival and the Ron Paul campaign rallies in Tampa.
Gene, can Romney defeat Obama, or let's just call him by his real name, Barry Soetoro? Or will it even get that far, given that the Constitution clearly states only an American-born citizen can be president of the United States?
Let me clarify that Ron Paul has never questioned Barack Obama's citizenship, and I do not question Barack Obama's citizenship. We have to assume that he is a citizen. His birth certificate has been made public, and there's no reason to believe he's not. And I will point out the leading advocates for denouncing Obama as not being a citizen are people like Alan Keyes and Jerome Corsi, who actively supported George W. Bush and his New World Order and his aggressive war in Iraq, who actively supported George W. Bush no matter how much he pushed up the national debt, no matter how much he expanded the federal government. The argument over Barack Obama's citizenship is a distraction being put on to distract conservatives and libertarians from the real issues, which is that the Republican Party has committed itself to big government and to aggressive warfare as much as the Democratic Party has. And seeing that happen, there is no other basis for the Romney campaign. Mitt Romney cannot run on his Massachusetts record, since his Massachusetts record was a matter of big government. He succeeded 2 Republicans who cut Massachusetts government, and he expanded Massachusetts government. He cannot run on his Massachusetts record because in some ways his record in Massachusetts was better on civil liberties issues than his campaign stands are now. He has no record to run on, and he has no philosophy to run on, since he stood on both sides of every major issue. I think it was summed up best by a Republican congressman who tried to figure out a reason to support Mitt Romney, and he said, whether you're a liberal or an extreme conservative, Mitt Romney's been there for you at one time or another. And the problem is, if you're an American, Mitt Romney has not been there for you at any time.
The leading polls such as Reuters and Politico had any Republican candidate beating Obama. How close do you think this election is going to be, Gene?
It's going to be a very close election. In any normal situation, with the economy being as bad as it is, with unemployment continuing at close to 9% nationwide and above 11% in California, the incumbent president, President Barack Obama, would be in serious trouble. In any normal election, a president who allowed his attorney general to supply guns to Mexican drug cartels would be out the door already. But this is not a normal election. Barack Obama is facing Mitt Romney, and every indication seems to be that Mitt Romney will go down in flames in November. He will not carry Massachusetts, the state he was governor of. He will not carry California, the largest state in the country. The election will be fought out in a few Midwestern states where there's very high unemployment, but where those people who are employed, in many cases, are employed in factories that were bailed out with taxpayer money by the Obama administration in order to reward his union allies in the United Auto Workers Union. So it does not look very good for Mitt Romney unless early retirement is seen as a good thing. Admittedly, Mitt Romney has 5 mansions that he can live in, so he doesn't need the White House to live in. And admittedly, Mitt Romney has enough money to live on for the rest of his life, so he doesn't need the presidential salary. And admittedly, whatever policies Mitt Romney was likely to put into effect after January 2013 will probably be put into effect by Barack Obama after January 2013. So Mitt Romney himself has nothing to worry about. But the American people have had their choice eliminated because there was no choice in the Republican Party other than Ron Paul, and for obvious reasons, since Ron Paul stands for America and not the Republican Party hack ideology of big government, there's no chance he would get it. So the real choice for Americans, if they want to show their commitment to individual freedom and to keeping America at peace with the world, is to vote for former New Mexico Governor Gary Johnson, running on the Libertarian Party ticket.
Welcome back to the Bruce Montalvo program. Now, again, I'm speaking with Gene Berkman, the head of the Riverside Libertarian Party. Gene, I just wanted to touch upon the fundamental similarities between Romney Care and Obamacare.
The fundamental similarity is the requirement that everybody must purchase health insurance. It's a mandate, and it's unusual in America. There is no other mandate where you are required to buy something just because you exist. Now, many states do have laws requiring you to buy car insurance, if you drive a car. But if you don't drive a car, you don't have to buy car insurance. You may have to buy other kinds of insurance if you do a particular thing. If you are a welder, you might be required to buy insurance, or if you engage in some other dangerous occupation. But just to be born in America, to be required to buy insurance or anything else, that was the basis of Romneycare. Romneycare in Massachusetts was the first implementation of this idea. And the idea itself did not come from the Democrats. It did not come from the Obama administration. It came from the Heritage Foundation, a supposed conservative think tank closely allied with the Ronald Reagan and George Bush administrations. They came up with the idea of the mandate. And corollary with the mandate is the requirement on insurance companies to insure everybody. And this is a kind of regulation that is unprecedented in America. Even though everybody who has a car is required to buy car insurance, insurance companies are not required to sell you insurance if they deem you an unsafe driver. Now, admittedly, medical care is a very real issue, and those of us who believe in the free market advocate free social safety net to provide for poor people. But to require everybody in the country to buy insurance and to require every insurance company to abide by a regulation to sell insurance to anybody, that's the basis of Romneycare in Massachusetts, and it's the basis of Obamacare nationwide. So Governor Romney can hardly make a case against the biggest expansion of government power of the Barack Obama administration. All he can do is say, well, he can lie. He can speak out of both sides of his mouth. And admittedly, he does have experience at that. So who knows? He may be able to pull that off, pull the wool over the eyes of a few people. But it's hardly going to be an effective campaign for the vast majority of Americans who will be made aware both by the Obama campaign and by the Libertarian Party campaign that the fundamental principle behind Barack Obama's government-run medical care system was first implemented in Massachusetts when Governor Romney signed Romneycare.
Now, before our time is up, Gene, I wanted to ask you about New York's new infamous large soda ban. Now, this to me is proof that we, the people, it's time for we, the people, to ban stupid government bans.
This is once again the nanny state, and Mayor Bloomberg of New York City, who has plenty of freedom in his own life because he's a billionaire, he can do anything he wants, seems to think that other people are too stupid to run their own lives. More and more people are realizing that sugar-filled drinks are poison, and sugar is itself a poisonous ingredient in too many of our food products. But the choice to take that chance should remain with the individual. And to take that freedom away in the name of protecting people's health just shows contempt for the average person by people who think they know better than you how to run your own life. It's the last gasp of the Bloomberg administration. He will not be running for re-election next year, but he really wanted to go out with a bang, and instead he's going to go out with a band.
Well, as always, Gene, it's a pleasure to have you on our broadcast. It's always great to have your input on our show.
Thank you for having me on your program. I'm glad to share my thoughts with your listeners who I know are interested in individual liberty and the threats to our liberty posed by the bipartisan political system and by the New World Order that it supports. And I'm glad always to take part in your program, which we broadcast here from Renaissance Bookshop on Elizabeth Street in Riverside, California. And for more information on the New World Order and the threat it poses to our freedom, and on the libertarian alternative to that New World Order, come on by Renaissance Bookshop in Riverside.